Okay, so I'm really pleased that we're able to get Veronica to paint that picture to set us up for the conference, and this is also a good segue. I'm not stealing Dennis's thunder too much to mention our second keynote speaker, Dr. Dennis Khoo. Dennis, welcome. I'm really thrilled that we're able to have you share your insights on digital transformation with us, because I think that anyone who's connected to APIs or digital technologies in general is always in this conversation, either with their peers or with colleagues in different lines of business or in other organizations entirely. And I cannot think of a large enterprise that has not been through at least one and sometimes several digital transformations, and to varying degrees of success. So I'm really looking forward to you sharing with us what it takes to succeed in this area. Welcome.
Well, thank you, John. Can you hear me? Can you hear me well?
Yes, yeah, I can hear you perfectly.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you first. Thank you very much for inviting me. I think my keynote on digital transformation is really a misnomer. As you mentioned, is really very important, because as you see in this keynote, is one of the major reasons why transformations have such high failure rates. So let me jump into the presentation and first talk about what really is transformation, right? And this is the Cambridge Dictionary definition of transformation. So it's a complete change in the appearance or character of something or someone, especially so that that thing or person is improved. And I think the key definitive words here are complete change. And here we're talking about a person or a thing. So it's about the appearance of character, and very importantly, so that the whole thing or person is improved. But when it comes to digital transformation, I don't think we have very clear definitions. And this cartoon indicates this very clearly. So when asked what is the top priority and what do we mean by digital transformation, you get many answers, right? Whether it's digital first, data-driven, customer-centric, agile, cloud. So in fact, what the cartoon here is saying in jest is that perhaps we should start with what it doesn't mean. And the next slide shows my take on it is that there's really no such thing as digital transformation. And here I offer 3 definitions of digital transformation. First definition is that there is no such thing, because you just can't transform digitally. It's not possible. And my definition, to expand it a little bit further, to me is really about the transformation of a business to improve experience at lower and lower costs, leveraging process, people, information technology, data, new ways of working, and many other things. And third, I hope this is not the definition for most of you, that it's just another way for someone to sell you more hardware and software that you don't really need. And to me, the winner is really number 2. Digital transformation is not about digital, actually. It's about the transformation of business to improve experience at lower and lower cost. And later you'll see in a subsequent slide that most businesses, most incumbent businesses, are in what I call the experience quadrant, where leveraging processes is key. And of course, people, information technology, data, new ways of working, they are all essential to make the transformation successful. Now, to begin, transformations are very complex. You first have to make sure, and one of the key topics that you guys are talking about, APIs, are really to expose the core business system functionality so that you can build software that's flexible, that is low code, that is highly reusable. But if you look at a transformation and look at the components, there are actually you actually find that actually there are many of components, and it's quite really complicated to put everything together. You have selling online, and of course there's also selling offline and how you integrate the off and online. You have the service issues. How do you resolve problems online? How do you enable staff to help customers? You have engagement. How do you personalize the experience? How do you proactively anticipate problems? How do you influence decisions? Then there's data-driven decisions that can make better decisions and actually replace humans. For example, in the call centers, replacing with intelligent chat. For companies that make stuff, there's intermediate and raw material supply chain is a big problem because you can't be selling what you can't produce. There's logistics. How do you track and deliver goods? There's manufacturing. You actually need to create the physical products. And there's robotics. How do you replace human action? Now, when you put all this together, you can see how complicated transformations really are. Even if you're just doing the back end or the front end, not doing the entire company-wide transformation in the blue circle, it's still very complicated. But there's another reason for the complexity today, I think that's very important for us to understand. And if you break anything into 3 levels, right? The first level, what I call level 1, is really about why. Why are we doing it and what are we doing? And let's take a simple example, right, of why data is the new gold. Data is the new gold because what we need to do is manage it as a strategic resource so that we can mine that new gold. Now, the problem today is that because of the shrinking of the knowledge gap and the pervasive use of the internet, knowledge of such things has become very commonplace. So the why and the what are really no longer what can differentiate you. If you go down one more level, then you get to the next level of detail of the what. And you can see in this slide that you then need to think through how do you establish the lineage at creation. Lineage meaning how do you link to make sure that every single piece of data can be linked back to an entity, a person, etc. You need to think of how you're going to centralize creation of data, make sure that it's described properly, make sure it's maintained. You need to think about how you're going to govern it, because if it's a very strategic resource, how can it be governed by the top of the organization and not the bottom? And then, of course, you've got to make sure that there's very little replication at a single source of truth. But the real action actually happens now in the how. So as you can see in the how, it breaks down even further, right? How do you define the data dictionary with the right descriptor fields? How do you catalog the business rules? How do you change and yet retain control and auditability? What are the frameworks, processes, standard operating procedures, and so on and so forth? So you can see very quickly that at level 3, things become really complicated, even though it starts very simply in level 1. And I put to you that today, the major differentiation you can bring in the transformation is at level 3, because level 1, everybody knows it, but not many people know how to bring it about. And the other major complexity comes from alignment. How do you align the how to the next level what, to the high level what, and the why you're doing it? And this is really one of the reasons why digital transformations are so complicated. And hence, if you look at it, most digital transformations fail. Based on the source, and you can see on this slide, is anywhere between 5%, which is what Bain estimates it to be, to 30%, which is what BCG estimates to be in terms of success rates. So the other 70 to 95% of transformations today don't achieve their stated objective. So how can you succeed in a world that's complicated? I offer 4 reasons, 4 actions that you can take to have a better success rate in your transformation. And these are, 1, I think it's very important for companies who want to succeed to focus on the problem and not the solution. Now, this sounds very easy, but actually it's very hard to do, especially in technology-driven companies, because in technology-driven companies, instead of thinking about what are the problems to be solved, there is a tendency to jump immediately into the solution, to implement AI or to implement something that is the newfangled thing. But how do you know that that's really the problem is the key question here. The second, as you can see, is fairly complicated. Most times you can't make the complexity go away by simply ignoring. And therefore, you have to work out what are the interactions, linkages that are key for you to grasp and manage this resulting complexity. Third, most ideas don't end up as innovations. And therefore, understanding how your idea can pass through the desirable, which means customers want it, they're willing to pay for it, viable, which means at some stage it's going to make money, aligned with your risk tolerance, and finally feasibility, where it has a high probability that it's going to be a successful execution. Number 4, and I put to all of you that actually in reality, design, process, and technology need to work together to form what I call a concept to code factory. And today, the weakest linkages in that factory are design and process. And I'll show you an example later that really brings this to life. So I put forth to you that actually today, in today's situation, design and process are actually more important than the technology. And finally, of course, how do you get the right combination of internal and external talent? Because one of the biggest issues today, of course, is that talent is very scarce. But I don't think the solution is to look all external or all internal. And the best I've seen combine the two together, bringing external people who can understand how new ways of doing things, but often because we are not actually changing the way we make money, the people from within the organization who know how money is made are actually very critical to the success of the transformation as well. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail. First, the focus on the problem and not the solution. Now, a good example of this would be the transistor. The transistor was actually invented in 1947. And one of the first use of it was really because the transistors could amplify signals. It was really used in radios, right, and hearing aids. And by 1954, a transistor radio for consumer use had been produced. But it wasn't until 1958 that transistors began to be used in integrated circuits. And of course, today, all of you carry billions of transistors around in your pockets because since 1971, with the advent of the Intel processor, transistors have now been used in microprocessors in a very wide way. So as you can see, if you start with the solution, which is the way most technology companies would work, you have to pivot, and that pivoting may take place over a long period of time. And for most companies, you are not in the business of pivoting. You are in the business of leveraging technology for your business. So when you create something and you find that there's no big use case, you're going to have to write it off. In fact, IDC estimates that in 2019, $1.3 trillion was spent by companies all over the world on digital transformation, but they estimated that 800 billion of that was wasted, most likely written off because the problem was not very clear. And you can see on this chart that actually then there are two ways that you can go about it. One is to start the solution. For example, with an idea, right? Let's make everyone invest online. So one of the problems in this solution-based approach is that you're not really clear whether this is a solution that everybody wants, how many people want it, and are they willing to pay for it. So for most companies, my advice would always be to start with a problem and be very clear what that problem is. So why don't people invest more? It could be because they don't have the risk appetite. They don't want to lose any money at all. And if you don't want to lose any money, then how can you really invest? So this is the way to go for most companies, because pivoting is really overrated, right? If you have to pivot, most startups that pivot, they're going to run out of money, right? And they have a solution to something that nobody wants, and that's why they need to pivot. Most incumbent companies can't pivot. They would have to write the investment off. And that's one of the failure points, focusing too much on the solution. Now, it's not sufficient to just understand the problem, though. You have to know the problem better than your customer. Now, think about it, right? How many of you know the customer better than know the problem better than your customer? Because if you do know your problem better than your customer, then you're one step ahead of your competition. And understanding the problem better than your customer requires you to answer 3 questions. Number 1, very simply, what is the problem? Although it sounds very simple, it's actually quite hard for most companies to answer. What is the problem I'm trying to solve? And then very importantly, not to jump to how to fix it, but why does it exist? And finally, of course, once you understand why it exists, then how do you fix it? And the steps that encompass this approach are, number 1, of course, identify the segment that you're interested in. Then the segment should lead you to the gaps. What are the gaps that the segment is facing? From there, the insights come from why do these gaps exist? And once you understand why these gaps exist, I find that most companies are able to construct the experience very quickly. And finally, you have to separate the experience from the process, because by doing so, you are able to properly trade off between the experience the client wants and the process that you need for internal efficiency and productivity. So the input of this is basically the gaps and the insights, and the output is really the customer value proposition. Now, as you could see, it's actually quite complex to manage a transformation well. So the key dimensions you need to think about are really the customer dimension, with the elements I just described, right? Segments, gaps, insights, experience, process. But you also need to think about the business dimension. How can you make money in a time period that's aligned with your risk appetite? And that looks at differentiation, right? The path to profit, the scaling, and the core competence gap. Now, the issue with this is that these, what we call elements, right? Differentiation, path to profit, scaling, and core competence gap also interact with each other. A very simple example would be if your differentiation is very large, right? Then you probably have less of a problem scaling because it's very different, but you could have a big path to profit gap because your core competence gap is quite big. Then if you decide that, okay, I want a better path to profit, a shorter path to profit, then you think, okay, maybe I'll scale down the differentiation. But if you scale down the differentiation, then you might have a problem with scaling because it's not sufficiently differentiated. And if you have a problem with scaling, then you will have a problem with path to profit as well. So you can see how some of these interactions are really cyclical, and therefore managing them well is very important to the successful outcome of any transformation. And in the capabilities dimension, you have another 6 elements around design, methodology, data, information technology, ecosystems, and new disciplines, of which design, methodology, data, and IT are standard in any transformation in any company. And finally, very importantly, people and leadership dimensions, the culture, the values, what are you trying to do? What's your ambition? How do you measure? How do you lead the organization to foster an innovative culture and environment? How do you narrow the talent gap? And how do you structure the entire organization? So you can see very quickly, it gets fairly complicated. And you have to manage these things in a separate and distinct way, but yet they're interconnected, as you could see from my example, and they have complex circular loops, and therefore the whole thing must also be managed very holistically. Now let's move on to the third point, right? And that's around desirable. Customer wants it and is willing to pay. It's viable, they will make a profit at some stage, align the risk appetite, is feasible, there's a high probability of success. And there are a couple of examples of products on the screen here. And what we're going to do is ask the audience, right, to place the segue in these three circles. And I believe we have a poll with a couple of options in terms of where the segue should be. And I think I'm going to hand it over to Dennis to conduct the poll.
So, yes, Dennis. So the poll is live now. So the audience, if you look, most people are probably looking on the right-hand side at the chats. There is also a poll there. You click on the poll tab, and you can see the question that Dennis is asking. So, Dennis, because there is a slight delay between you broadcasting and you appearing on the hop-in screen, we may need to wait a little while for people to respond. Perhaps we can pause for a moment, but then the results we may share with you as you've gone a little bit further down.
Okay, would you like me to continue and then we'll come back?
I think that would be best. So when I have the results of the poll, then I will share them with you, and we can take it from there.
Okay, it's great. Thanks. So I'm just going to skip a couple of slides, and then we can wait for the results to come back. And I'm going to go to the next point first, and then we'll come back when the poll is available. So remember, the fourth point was really around design and process, right? And I put forth to you that actually design and process are actually, at this stage, most of the issues we see with transformation are really around the design and process area rather than the technology area. And I'd like to give you this analogy, right? Now, if you are asked to build the best building in your hometown, and money is not a problem, right? We're going to give you all the money you need. Most people don't showcase the builder first. So the question is, then why do we showcase technology every time we're talking about business transformation? In fact, then it calls into question, why is it called digital transformation? Right? So if you're going to build the best building, let's say in Singapore, you're really going to focus on the architect first. And the architect is the one that really thinks through the future of work, the future of play, right? The future of living, and then understand the needs of the segment that you are targeting. Because obviously different segments have different gaps. And they're going to understand the insight and create the experience. So that equivalent is really the designer. Not only the designer of your product service, but the designer of your entire business model and operating model. And after the architect does his job, you still need to think about the civil engineer, because the architect doesn't ensure that the building can stand on its own. It's really the civil engineer that looks at the entire building and whether it can basically stand on its own 2 feet. And that equivalent is really your process team. And of course, if the architect and the civil engineer does a good job, then you still need a good builder. And therefore, of course, technology is still important. But if the design and the process are very weak, then actually most of the time at the technology stage, you already know that it's not going to work because the requirements are not clear. And one of the things we notice most is that a lot of times the process piece is the biggest weakness because it's often ignored. And it's the process piece that I subscribe should really translate the product, service, business model requirements into the stories. And through there, you need to basically do very good journey data mapping, and of course, the design of the entire experience, interface, etc. So design and process, I put to you, are therefore more important than just the technology.
So, Dennis, I think this is a good point to review our poll results.
Yes.
We have some. We can see them in your chat, but I can read them out to you also. So
yeah,
if you want to go back to your slide,
and let's see what the answers are.
Thanks everyone for participating in the poll. So your first question was, Was it desirable only? And nobody voted for. Hang on. Nobody voted for that.
So what
No.
was the biggest score? Where did
The
everybody?
biggest score was viable plus feasible. No, sorry, desirable, viable, and feasible.
So right in that sweet spot in the
41.
center. Am I right,
Right.
John?
Yes.
And what percentage of the response?
41%.
Wow, that's big. And every time I do this poll, I get around that number. Between roughly half the audience think that is in the sweet spot. And the purpose I use this example is to illustrate actually it's quite difficult to understand whether something's desirable by people even after it's been created. And therefore you can see that how difficult it must be when it's being created to understand whether something's desirable, viable, feasible. So let me share with you what I think the answer should be. Now, some background, the segue, right? It costs more than 100 million in R&D to produce. In fact, the founders did show it to Steve Jobs, and Steve Jobs told them that it would never succeed. Now, it weighs 100 pounds, which means that you need really the ecosystem, right? Because if you're going to ride it to the office, you need a place to charge it. You're not going to be able to carry it to your office because it's very heavy and it's not small. Now, it was priced very high at launch, right? $5,000 over dollars. It didn't have the ecosystem support. They expected to sell 10,000 units a week, but they only ever sold a very small 140,000 in its entire life, and actually it's been discontinued. And the worst story is that the owner of the company that eventually bought the Segway in, I believe, was 2008 or 2009, while using the Segway, he was a rich man. He was riding the Segway, in his house, and his house was on top of a cliff, and he fell off the cliff and died. So clearly it can't be desirable. And if you notice, the Segway is actually mostly used in security and for tourist applications. So if you look at where it should be, then really it's at the borderline of feasible because they managed to produce it. It's not viable because it couldn't make money in the time frame that was aligned to their risk appetite, and clearly it can't be desirable if it kills someone. So I don't know how many of you agree with this, but that's my answer in terms of the Segway. And here are all the rest of the products that you saw on the previous slide. And interestingly, for example, the well-known Post-it was actually, I would say, in the desirable, viable, but not feasible quadrant when it was first produced, because they meant to make very sticky glue, but eventually it wasn't sticky, and they had to change the use case for glue that couldn't stick very well before it went to that center sweet spot. So you can see how it's actually quite hard to go from idea to innovation, because you've got to meet all these three hurdles. And a lot of companies are not closely looking at whether they are meeting the desirable, viable, and feasible criteria. Thanks, John, for the poll. So we come to this very important understanding of process, and where process is even more important, right? So let me orientate you to what I think is a very important way to understand your business. On the vertical axis is what I call singular performance impact. That means there are one or two things you can do that would significantly change the impact of your product or service on the customer. And this could be speed over cost, right? It could be enjoyment over price, right? It could be duration over price, right? Or quality over price. And we categories here are small and large. And then on the horizontal axis, you have whether it's less difficult or more difficult in terms of adoption by the customer. And so if something is really easy to adopt and use, then it'd be less difficult. If something is difficult to adopt and use, then it would be in the difficult quadrant. So you end up with 4 different quadrants here. The first, of course, to make sure that you're not in the quadrant whereby you don't really have any singular performance impact, one or two things you can do to really change the game, and it's actually very easy to adopt, meaning that people can defect very quickly. Now, we hear a lot about this second category, what I call the breakthrough category, right? And these are examples like Uber, all the very famous examples we always hear about, Netflix, Airbnb. The example I'd like to highlight, though, is the LED light bulb. And why I find that's an interesting example is because with an LED light bulb, an 8-watt LED outputs as much light as a 60-watt light bulb. So it's a 7x savings in your power bill annually for 5x the price, but lasting 3 times longer. So you find that most companies in this quadrant, you can state your value proposition in one line. Very simple, right? 7x saving in your power bill. It's 5x the price, but it lasts 3 times longer. So when you work it out, you'll find that over a long period of time, you have a significant savings. And that's why most incandescent light bulbs have been replaced by LED light bulbs. The bicycle is another good example because riding a bicycle is 5 times more efficient than walking. And therefore, companies in this category, you can work on your minimum viable product because there are 1 or 2 things that you're going to do that can completely revolutionize your performance. But actually, most of us are not in this quadrant, although the industry is inundated by the few companies that are in this breakthrough quadrant. You can, of course, also be in the breakthrough quadrant and find that, hey, my adoption is much more difficult. So when the iPhone first came out, you had to get used to apps. The electric car, right? Trying to charge an electric car actually is much, much longer than pumping petrol. You can pump petrol generally in 10 minutes, but generally to charge a car, you might need up to an hour to charge it if it's very low. So this illustrates that actually, because of the difficulty of adoption, you need to think through the whole system, the whole ecosystem needed to support it. But I put to you that actually most of us are in what I call the experience-led quadrant. The digital bank, for example, Tomorrow by UOB that I helped to create, a digital bank is clearly experience-led because there's no 1 or 2 things you can do other than giving away everything free that would cause many companies to want to abandon who they're banking with and defect to you. The iMac is a very good example. A lot of the components in the iMac are sourced, right? Of course, now Apple has the M1 chip, but Apple's focus is really on integrating the entire hardware and software into a brilliant experience. And that's why Apple can still charge a premium in a sea of competitors that are really probably more in the insufficient value quadrant. Now, once you understand this, then you understand that if most of us are in the experience-led quadrant, then process become even more important. And you can see companies like Apple are actually very, very focused on the smallest detail, like the roundness of the phone, for example. And this clearly shows that an obsession with the process and the detail is very important. And a lot of companies are not focusing on that. Now, to round off my presentation, I'd like to share a couple of best practices in design, process, and tech. The first 2 are around design. And I think it's very important to pay attention to what's very important, irreversible. So some choices are more important than others. Therefore, understanding an irreversible decision, those are the ones that you need to take more time. And those you can't pivot. You need to think through properly, make the right decision, understand the considerations, because once you decide, you can't turn back. The second one is knowing what customers want is very good, but why they want it is really the key. Because when I work with clients, when I ask them, right, what insight do you have to power your new experience? The answer is often, I don't have any new insight. And the likelihood that you can create a breakthrough experience with no new insight is actually very, very low. So therefore, you wonder why, if you wonder why people produce the same thing, it's because the insight is missing. The next 2 are around process, right? Now, we are going to have a shortage of coders for the next 20 years. And the problem with coding is that the more you code, actually, the more problematic it becomes. That's why this whole conference around the use of APIs is really part of how do you do lower code software. And this is important along with the fact of how can you change the process to fit the solution rather than always customizing the solution to fit the process, because it creates more complexity and more code. And very importantly, to spend time, as you can see, I've illustrated in this keynote, the business process is the one that delivers experience. It's not the technology per se, because the technology is applied to the business process to make it run faster, better, with less errors, and of course, a lower operating cost. Finally, in technology, flexibility is very important, right? We often don't think about this, but once you automate something, it can't be changed easily as it could when it was on pen and paper. And finally, I think that there's not enough focus in tech on the modularity and the low code, because that's the key to lower cost of ownership. And a lot of the businesses are complaining that the cost of ownership today is simply too high. If you want to know more, you can find out more from my two publications, Driving Digital Transformation, or a new step-by-step guide that me and my co-author Jun Kyu have come up with to actually help companies go through and manage the complexity that you've heard in my keynote today. Thank you very much. That's my keynote for today. I think we're going to go to some Q&A right now.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dennis. I particularly like that highly technical term you used very early on, companies that make stuff. As an engineer by profession, I very keen on companies that make stuff. Admittedly, an electronic engineer, so I'm already familiar with the bits and bytes. But I think a lot of organizations are struggling with the idea of this digital thing, because the company was created to do something that wasn't especially digital. They were making things. And in the last 20 years, we've seen a number of companies that were really good at making certain things just go out of business because their business model got crushed. Right. Kodak made revolutionary in terms of film cameras, but nobody uses film anymore. And you look at distribution type of industries like books and music and even retail, some of those business models have just been crushed by some alternative business models. So the companies in those industries feel that they need to rethink everything. And I guess what you're talking about is don't forget process, and also what you can learn and what you can transfer into that. When we look at how we manage software projects, actually, many of our project management principles came from the construction industry, and then the agile movement actually learned lessons from the manufacturing industry. Exactly. So what sort of parting message would you give to an organization that was created for something else and now realizes they need to do things digitally?
Well, unfortunately, John, there's no simple answer to the question. In my book, Driving Digital Transformation, I did highlight Kodak, right? And actually, Kodak knew that it was coming, and Kodak held a lot of the patents to the technology. So you couldn't really say that Kodak failed because they didn't have the capability. They failed because the way the new business model is going to work didn't appeal to them. Basically, film made so much money, right? And once they perfected the coating of film, it was just such a big money spinner. But when you went to the digital camera, everything was off the shelf. You didn't have proprietary IP, right? And therefore, they couldn't get used to the business model where they were making such a large gross profit to one where the gross profit was much lower. But not only that, there was no proprietary technology you could own very easily, because they were all components that you had to assemble together. And therefore, they allowed competitors like Canon, right, to overtake them in the sense of being able to produce a highly scalable digital camera business. So they knew all along, right? But every time you showed the executives a digital camera, they would say, "Yeah, but where's the printing? Where's the
I think that gets back to your other comment about pivoting and recognizing that you've built a lot of assets, but sometimes you need to write the asset off and move on. And the digital transformation initiatives, although some of them may have failed, maybe there was things that you learned along the way that could help you in the next effort.
In fact, that point is very important because how Canon did it was they set up a separate unit. They weren't the first, but when they observed that Casio came up with something that looked like it was going to be the beginnings of a breakthrough, because obviously in technology, the beginning part is very nascent, right? I mean, it takes very poor quality pictures. It's very big, right? It's very costly. So you think, hey, it's not at the tipping point. But when they found that Casio had found the tipping point, they set up a separate unit actually and protected that unit, kept the funding away from the mother organization, which would have, kind of sucked the daughter unit dry. So I think unfortunately, it's very complicated. You have to get the customer, the business, the capabilities, the people and leadership elements all correct. And incumbent companies struggle to do that.
Well, thanks very much for sharing those insights, and that's set us up really well for the other sessions in this conference. Thanks very much, Dennis.